So today I'm going to do a few things. So usually start with a bit of a motivation to explain the broader project in which this all fits, and what is the motivation behind it, what is the open research agenda on political lotteries. Then the initial research that Ali presented fits in perfectly as an example, so I won't go over that again, but I will talk instead more about this initial research from an experiment on online citizen assemblies, which is a project co-authored with Dominic Duell at the University of Innsbruck and Anam Qureshi at the University of Antwerp. So I don't need to go into too much detail here about the motivation. We all know that these experiments with citizen assemblies, whereby randomly drawn citizens are brought together to deliberate, are growing across the world in different countries, are gaining in importance, and the question is what we can learn about that. A particular topic on which they've been organized is climate and how we can address climate change. There are lots of calls for and also experiments with these randomly drawn citizens assemblies, but also institutionalizing them into more permanent chambers of parliaments. And so with that shift, where these groups are sometimes given legislative initiative, or at least decision-making powers, comes an important question, and that is, what about the parties? What about the sort of natural ideological leanings that people will have, and what are the incentives there to build parties? And the question then becomes whether all these advantages that we know exist from random citizen assemblies can easily travel to such a legislative arena, where we know that the stakes are very high and party affiliations come into play. The broad and general research question of the broader project is not just whether, but really how can lotteries, as part of legislative or democratic institutions, widen access to governance to different minorities and support equality in democracies. And so when people talk about democracy and lotteries, they often go back, way back in time. Same picture here as we saw before today of the Claritarian, which, if I remember well, I saw actually in Athens. You can still see it in the museum of the Agora. Maybe Kostas, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And so people go back to this of course, very prominent example. We have a lot of recent work that is very fascinating on this particular case, but we know that lotteries were used in different scenarios. The Italian city republics are very often mentioned between the 14th and the 17th century, but there were others, such as in Spain, in England, and in Switzerland at a local level, and many others still. Lotteries can be found as examples as part of democratic government and republican government way back in time. And there's also some recent work which gives a lot of examples on this, mainly theoretically or from a broader historical overview. So lotteries were often used to select office holders, but then the story goes, mass elections took over as more people were getting involved, as this was upscaled, right? And so from lotteries, democracies moved to elections to organize the way to select office holders. And for a lot of people that are thinking about what is maybe going wrong with democracy today, this element of citizen participation that was there by lotteries is what is really missing today. But what is not often known, or what is less well known, is that lottery did not immediately disappear, and this story is an important story to tell. It did not immediately disappear in modern democracy. In fact, they were used extensively throughout democratizing Europe, and we don't know much about them in our empirical democratization studies. And so addressing that is part of this project that I will be working on in the next 5 years, together with Ali, of course. So the questions that I ask is, did lotteries really widen access to minorities? And if they did so, how? Was it maybe the case that where lotteries were used, it really enabled constitution drafting, given that such high stakes were at play? Constitutions, the shift to democratic government, which would have consequences down the line for many years and centuries, as we know, post hoc. What was the interaction with the party system development, which was happening at the same time? So what was the interests of these parties that were emerging at the time, and how did that structure the way that the lotteries worked? And are there maybe long-term consequences for political inequality that we've maybe underestimated because we've sort of forgotten these peculiar procedures? So the methodology of the project is historical, to check each natural experiment separately and then place that together with online experiments today in a comparative perspective. And you can think of examples where this happened in one-shot cases, as in the example of Denmark we saw today, but it also happened in more modern legislators, as we have some work on in the past, where this happened repeatedly over time. And it's, of course, particularly there that you need to think about party system dynamics and the dynamics of using lotteries repeatedly over time, and which actors have an interest in capturing that process. So the example today is really this constituent assembly in Denmark, where you had lotteries determining the different committees, who then met and discussed and prepared the constitution and the draft of the constitution. And the idea is to put all these different examples into a comparative analysis to study the use, also the reasons for the abolishment, and the effects of what we call these lottery-based procedures across countries and time. And so the important hypotheses are sort of listed here. One idea is that they are really used in context, I cannot emphasize this enough, where conflict is really high. Yeah? If conflict is not that important, then there are better and more efficient ways of organizing political decision-making. So when there's high distrust, when party systems are splintered, when it's not clear who the opposition is, like who belongs to which party maybe, and when you have huge, for example, inequalities as you had in the 19th century, of course, this is a scenario where lotteries might be used by actors and might be successful. I say might, because it depends. Then the second thing to study is to think about is whether these lotteries really opened access to the decision-making process, as we assume that lotteries do, because that's in their very nature. By randomly drawing individuals, you equalize opportunity of access to all. You strengthen the minorities who may otherwise be easily ignored. So the question there is whether, when you open this access, are there long-term consequences? Does that work by leveling political inequality in political selection, for example? Does it work through the types of decisions that are made in this legislature? And how does that translate into evolution over time? So the three main hypotheses are summarized here. So first, when it's used in highly conflictual situations, it might be precisely useful for enabling collaboration to exist in the first place. So for example, the procedures that were used in this one-shot fashion in constituent assemblies, it might enable party system development over time because you have a procedure in place while these parties emerge. And thirdly, once these parties become stronger, they will prefer a more efficient procedure and they might move to abolish these procedures. And that you can test by looking at these procedures in repeated legislative assemblies. And it's important to understand the long-term effects on political inequality from this broader academic point of view, right? To understand what is really going on in the long term when we use such procedures. So method-wise, it's a lot of data collection that hasn't been done before. So it's using information on 19th century legislators, the way they voted, the characteristics they had. Sometimes they weren't even in formalized parties, etc. And then for each natural experiment, the idea is to analyze each lottery in country and over time to really check whether it increased the diversity of the people involved in the political debates. Did it do that? And then secondly, can we show that there are any long-term effects, either because it affected the votes, as you saw in the Denmark case this morning, or because it enabled party system development, or because it affected long-term inequality. Now, some of these lotteries can, of course, be a bit limiting, which is why we also want to implement this in online experiments. Why? Because we can control more of the aspects of lotteries. We can, of course, not go back in time in history and change these things, but to check really whether the idea that certain mechanisms are going on also receives support in experiments today. And then finally, putting this all together in a comparative analysis to inform successful lottery design today. So, and I've given this talk a number of times, so I know that you're going to tell me, but why? Why does this matter? So, lessons from lotteries to today. Why does it matter for today? If you think about the example that Ali presented this morning, you have elected legislators being randomly assigned to different committees. And what we saw there was very little room for deliberation to really have a strong effect. Yeah? But at the same time, Denmark wrote a constitution, right? And the constitution remains in place today. So one comment is, well, elected legislators are very different from ordinary citizens. Yeah? In this constituent assembly, you have a binding decision, very high stakes. You have huge inequalities and conflict, low levels of trust, but consensus is really important here, right? You will not achieve a constitution unless this is a broadly supported process. You really need consensus of all the actors involved, regardless of their particular stance on specific items of this question. And so this may be very different from citizen assemblies today. It may be a particularly hard case to discover any deliberation effects because we know that partisan beliefs are important here. But actually, I would argue it's very similar to today's problem about climate change mitigation, where you also have huge inequalities between actors, right? Because addressing climate change will have huge redistributive consequences. It's a scenario where consensus is very important for collective action, where this needs to be a decision supported by a lot of different actors. And so we have lessons to learn from these legislative assemblies. Lottery holds promises for this deliberation to work, but we need to take serious that the redistributive effects may encourage strategic behavior. And you see it in some ways in the backlash that some of these assemblies have had in the past. So I wanted to give you this overview to let you know what the project is about, but also to give a good introduction of why I will now present a slightly peculiar, interesting, hopefully, experiment. So the idea was to model a present-day citizen assembly in a very abstract way, but by introducing financial incentives, as you would in a behavioral experiment, to really understand, to be able to predict what should happen, and to really understand what the mechanism is in different steps. Here, in particular, to introduce strategic behavior. So I will go on to that now. So how do people deliberate and decide in strategic environments? Here we apply this to climate change collective action. I mentioned how it's relevant and important because of high stakes and because of the promises that lotteries give us here for randomly drawn decision makers. There are two aspects in this experiment that are really important for me in structuring the exercise. One is that this is a group decision, right? A lot of work has not thought about the fact that this, experimental work, I should say, is a group decision. And secondly, costs. Costs are also very important. When you think about citizen assemblies, you need to think about how people interpret this in terms of when it has real costs for them. So in this experiment, people are allowed to share, if they want to, they're not, it's voluntary, they're allowed to share their beliefs and opinions in an online group discussion, but I'm controlling certain parameters of this interaction to really understand what you should theoretically predict, or should theoretically find in such a setup. And the initial results that I will tell you about today come from a pilot experiment that I ran, where we find that if you tell people before going into the deliberation that a vote is going to come up which is costly for them, it changes the decision-making process. It changes their behavior and changes the outcome. Yeah? Okay. So we know a lot about deliberation. We also know a lot about how people think about addressing climate change from existing literature. And this is just a slide with 3 different important parts from the experimental literature on climate change deliberation. So first of all, the experimental literature on citizen assemblies and within deliberative democracy is positive, mostly positive, showing that individuals really learn, they really intensively deliberate, they pick up information, and they successfully take collective action against climate change. Yeah? There are a few studies that find null results or the opposite effects, but overwhelmingly positive evidence. The thing with these assemblies is that they're very often advisory, and so their decision that they take is not costly to the people involved, not directly costly, because it's not binding, because it's advisory, and more things happen down the line. And what we also know from this literature is that the way this conversation takes place, or the quality of this conversation, is really important. So it has to be well moderated, people have to be able to really express their minds, etc. What the literature also shows is that if you increase the complexity of this interaction, or you ask people to take a binding decision in a vote or something like that, it becomes more difficult to achieve these beneficial outcomes. So if we make this decision binding, that's a scenario where we should really expect strategic behavior. And this is a good model of thinking about parties developing in such environments. The second part of the literature that is relevant and important is the literature that looks at climate change mitigation. And when people support this, they find a lot of people support climate change mitigation, but what it really is conditional on to what extent they will be affected themselves. So the cost, they're supportive as long as the costs are low. And that is, of course, related to their pre-existing economic vulnerability, to these changing measures, to their ideology, altruism, egalitarian preferences, and so on. But what these studies and the next ones also ignore is that in these types of decision-making processes, decisions are taken collectively. So from behavioral experiments, we also know that we can think about climate change as a public bad, and people tend to underinvest in it. Yeah? So what is important for us, given that we know all this, what is it that we really want to distill? One, it has to be a group decision, yeah? And the costs have to be there have to be costs over substantively meaningful choices. So I hope I've now sufficiently motivated this experiment, and I will now go into the details and unleash the critiques. So our experiment was pre-registered. It's a pilot that took place in the lab because it's a pilot and because we understand and know that there are a lot of difficulties involved with encouraging good deliberation online. But people came to the experimental lab and were assigned a workstation and entered into an online deliberation with each other over Zoom. It allowed us to control video, sound quality, and so on. But they had an actual interaction online. It's an incentivized experiment, which means that after eliciting their current carbon footprint, we try to mimic the real costs in the lab of saying that you will reduce your pollution, your individual pollution. And then the question, of course, is this manipulation proof? Will there be changes to the deliberation and to the outcomes? So the experiment is incentivized. It's this type of experiment, but it's not incentivized to stick to an original randomly assigned viewpoint. That makes no sense when you're talking about these types of topics. You want people to really express their held opinions and beliefs about this. So people are allowed to do that, and what we randomly assign is which individuals are appointed to which groups. So participants would come into the lab, they would draw a number, a small little ball from a bag, and some of them would be sent home and some of them entered the experiment. So people are randomly assigned to the groups and to the treatment as well. Then we use their existing pollution behavior, as they tell us it is, to stretch out this group on a scale of income points. So some stand to gain or lose more than others financial incentives, in this experiment. The topic is, of course, also important because people have to talk about something that is substantively meaningful to them. And here we decided to follow the UK Climate Assembly, and we used their materials to make a really brief, really short distillation of these materials, and I'll show you later, on either flights or food. And that is not to say at all that we think that individuals can solve climate change by changing their own behavior, but what we want is that this deliberation is substantively meaningful for them, right? And that they don't think of these topics as, well, that's the government's job. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying, it's important that they deliberate over something that they can actually control, yeah? That the costs are meaningful to them also as well, not just, a strange, payoff in an experiment. So how do people then deliberate on collective action about climate change? So this is the basic structure of the experiment. Groups of 7 were recruited, and they first fill out a survey to elicit their climate policy preferences, after, of course, consent and information forms. And then they told us about their current carbon footprint. We took that and we assigned them to income points, 2 to 6, and we told them, this is your endowment, and every 2 points is worth an extra £1 in this experiment. Took place in the UK. Now, with some probability, however, climate catastrophe will happen, and then you will receive only 1 point of that endowment. Yeah? Catastrophe happens, it's bad for everyone. So how much tax are you now willing to pay to avoid that this catastrophe wipes out these earnings? That's what we call the pre-deliberation platform. There's a control group who doesn't talk at all. Yeah? There is a treatment group that goes into deliberation over Zoom, yeah? Because that has to be incentivized too. They have to come up with a group statement afterwards. And there's a strategic deliberation treatment where the only difference is that we first tell them, oh, the next stage is coming up, by the way, and that's a vote. Next stage is the vote. Everyone is told about the vote, if they hadn't been told before. And when they vote, we take this tax that they vote for from this endowment that we gave them. We also realize the catastrophe with some probability, so that if they didn't invest enough, they have a higher risk of their earnings being wiped out. And then we do other things that are typical of behavioral experiments to elicit willingness to cooperate, risk preferences, etc., and to make sure we have measures of that to control for these things. Okay, where are the incentives coming from? After reading the information, but before the deliberation and voting, we ask them, what do you think? Which of these 5 things do you think should happen? Nothing, a low tax, a low tax, a high or the highest possible tax. And then we show them, if this were a real vote, this is what the outcome would have been. Yeah? So this experiment, is important to point out, has a common value by design. Like, we designed it that way. Yeah? We wanted people to pick a higher tax because it's protective against climate change. It's an insurance, you can think of it, for everyone. The control group has no discussion, but before the vote, that's also important to mention, everyone knows the distribution of points, at least. And then finally, an important note to make is that moderators one moderator was present, but was purposely asked to stay neutral. So the only thing they did was say, well, this is work, I'm keeping time. Maybe they would say, perhaps you would like to contribute, and at the end, please write up a group statement. What would you expect to see? Well, a greater willingness to choose a higher tax from the deliberation effect. That's what you expect from these different theories on deliberation. And that might be because their attention is drawn by reading these information, or because they gained information, or because they're persuaded by some of the individuals that they're talking to. Deliberations were very short, 10 minutes only. The hypotheses on strategic deliberation are somewhat different. So if you know about the upcoming election, you introduce incentives to change this process because it might be better for you. financially if you have a different type of outcome. So it will change the nature of the deliberation, and then in our pre-registered experiment, we had a number of more detailed hypotheses, but I won't go into that too much today. So versus the control group, and remember we have this entry, voting, and outcome stage, we expect to see an outcome that deliberating groups more often vote for a higher tax, as you would see in lots of these other experiments taking place across the world. But in a strategic deliberation, you should see that they would choose for either of these two options, which means that the total effect is noisy. Yeah? So this positive deliberation effect is sort of decreased somehow, is disturbed. And the overall effect, well, we can't know. And then the mechanism is something we're still working on. We're analyzing what people said in the conversation, the quality of the deliberation, to sort of really test which of these three mechanisms can explain the deliberation effects. Should I go over the sequence of moves once again? Because I know it's a lot of things. Yeah, also happy to come back to this. These were the materials. For example, on flying, first, a small bit, very structured. This is how much flying matters. Secondly, technological improvements might happen, but that's uncertain. And then finally, you can do something by reducing your demand. Same for food. Yeah? Food is important in pollution. Technological improvements may happen and solve things, but demand from consumers may grow, so you can do something by reducing your demand. Very structured. Some initial results. So this is the number of groups we had and the number of people, 378 in total, and the distribution across deliberation, strategic deliberation, and a control group. At the top, you see the distribution in carbon footprints we forced them into, and underlying that, you see the distribution in carbon footprints they actually had in the lab. Yeah? So you see, it's not ideal. We would have preferred better distribution, but it's also not that bad. Yeah? In terms of, you can see that group 6 pollutes more, has a higher footprint than group 2. This is what they told us their initial preferences. So if they cared only about the financial incentive, you wouldn't see this. You would see very clearly that the people on the carbon footprint 6 would, say, do nothing. And people on carbon footprint 2 would say, highest reduction, purely financially, purely based on financial incentives. But you don't see this. You see a mix of things. What is important to note, though, is that almost no one said, in our sample at least, the people that were in our lab, that they wanted to do nothing. Yeah, there were a few of those, but not a lot of people said, do nothing. Quite a few, however, said lowest please or low reduction rather than high or highest. And this is the result. So we see the blue dot here that deliberating groups more often vote for the high tax level, so a high or highest level as group choices after having spoken to each other. But if we break that up between groups who were deliberating freely and groups who were told before that there would be this vote and their earnings would be affected in the experiment, you see a difference. You see that the deliberating group is positive. Strategic deliberation is less likely to support it. And the difference is significant, the green line, between these two different types of deliberation. The final thing I want to show you is, I talked a bit about, we also checked entry and voting and outcomes. So this was outcome. This was the outcome of these groups. This is at group level. Here we want to look at individuals voting. So among these 370 people, did they change their vote from their original preferences? And we don't see that if we leave it unrestricted in columns 1, 2, 3. But if we ask, did they change their vote away from what they were initially saying they would choose, to either a high or a highest tax level, as we encourage them to say, or as the experiment was designed to encourage them to do, we do see that it's more likely that those in the deliberation treatment moved there, and those in the strategic deliberation less so, restricting the sample, of course, to people who did not already have the highest preference in the first place, because they cannot be influenced any further. Okay, so to conclude, compared to the baseline and compared to each other, we see differences between the type of deliberation. Deliberation has great outcomes, but less so when the deliberation is strategic. The next step is to analyze the quality of these deliberations and to say something about why do we see this positive effect, and what is it that these people told us in this, or each other, not us directly, into why they cared about this and why a decision was so important. And this is just preliminary because it's only for parts of the sample, so it might change. Yeah? But we do see that the quality of the deliberation, as typically measured in the literature, was higher among the non-strategic group than in a strategic group on a number of different arguments, such as neutral arguments, neutral counter-arguments, no interruptions, etc. So in the future, the plan is to build this up and to scale this up, either by potentially bringing these people together in a larger group and then seeing what eventually happens in this larger assembly, or to dig in more detail and improve the tests of the deliberation mechanism. Another question that I often have and that I'm still thinking about, and I'm happy to talk about today, is whether you need to improve the real-life analogy of these experiments. A lot of people say, well, deliberation can just not be measured in 10 minutes. I say, well, these results actually show that you can. I mean, there clearly is a difference, even from as little as 10 minutes. Yeah? So I'm still thinking about this part. I'm not saying it's not important. Thank you.
Okay, so this is neat, and I actually think you have more in the qualitative, like the transcripts of the deliberation, or you could learn a lot. So my question would be, in the strategic group, do you see evidence of, okay, I have to convince everyone to agree, so I know I'm not going to get the tails, like it's going to, we're going to have to come up with like a happy medium, or do you see more bullying in the strategic group? Does anyone say like, well, okay, I'm going to be hurt the most, but okay, I'll compromise so we can come to like a coordination. Like the language and the tactics that people use to deliberate, can you look at the text of the groups and see differences? Like what do you see?
So, thank you, Ali. That's a really good one. So we're looking at this by using the DQI as is common in the literature, but we're also looking at whether they've used keywords such as election, majority, most important preference, things like that. And from a first glimpse, I mean, not everything has been coded yet, but it does seem to be the case that more often is part of the language, for example. So yeah, that's an important one.
Thank you. Dimitri Landa, NYU. It seems like the strategic deliberation treatment, the plausibility of the strategic deliberation treatment kind of relies on the subjects buying into the frame, right? And so my question is, do you have exit interview questions that give us a sense of whether they did buy into it or not, right? How much did the frame ultimately matter to them?
Did you say exit survey?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure it really answers this particular question. We did have an exit survey, actually, that we did not incentivize, as is common in citizen assemblies as well. We did not find any differences. People did not tell us that they were more trustworthy or that they were happy with the process, etc.
I mean, what I mean is, did your subjects really understand themselves as making a choice with respect to climate change policy? Or did they understand themselves as just playing a game that has, as you said, there was I don't know if it's the dominant strategy in the game or not, but whatever it is, right, for, to choose a high tax. So that's the question, right?
Yeah.
If they did understand themselves as really choosing a climate change policy, presumably we would interpret these results somewhat differently than if we thought this is just a
Yes.
diverting exercise.
That reminds me, I believe we also asked about if you are now if you are now thinking about implementing this really into your own life, how would you think about reducing, what are sort of the efforts you can make? If I'm not mistaken, it was one of our exit questions too. Yeah. But can't tell you yet what it was exactly. Yeah.
Another question I have is, have you thought about the possibility of a joint payoff version of the strategic deliberation game?
Okay.
So you have a binding policy choice, but their payoffs are individual private payoffs. So one thing you might think about is, having a joint payoff, group payoff. See how that alters the deliberation.
Well, the tax that they were paying is progressive, though. So the people the higher polluters are more intensively taxed in any case, if the tax level that is chosen is higher. So it partly addresses that, not entirely. Yeah.
That's not quite.
We can talk about it. Yeah.
Right. If you think about, right, so part of the value of doing a joint payoff is that a joint payoff would enable them to again see this as a more cooperative kind of exercise.
But there's a lot going on in the experiment, but we do have the shock of climate catastrophe. So sometimes it happens that if you choose a level of tax that is too low, you get a draw which is bad, and everyone's payments are reduced to 1. So, in this particular stage, yeah.
I think I just have a sort of an interpretive question. So you refer to it as a tax, but at one point you also refer to it as insurance.
Yeah.
Is it presented to them as insurance, or is it presented to them as a tax? Partly, this is, I think, this speaks to the collective dimensions of what they think they're doing, right? So you mentioned that you mentioned very you stressed that you were not presupposing that there are individual solutions to climate change. But I think that if you think that you can buy insurance against climate change, that's precisely imposing a kind of an individual solution. Not in the sense of like, I can solve climate change, but rather I can buy myself out of the consequences of climate change. I just wonder how you present it to them.
Experiments like that have been done. And what you see is the typical free rider problem. It's very hard to get collective action. People tend to not put enough into this common fund to protect and to buy investments. That's why it was so important that they would talk to each other and make a decision collectively, as in a vote which is decided by plurality rule, which is binding for everyone, also the people who did not vote for this. Yeah. So I think that's precisely what the experiment tries to add to, experimental literature is already out there. Yeah.
Did you say you had results on interruptions? Who interrupts? Or the high climate? Is it the men? Is it the, because there's large literature, especially in the parliamentary, committees about who interrupts and senior politicians and gender, So who was interrupting, and did it vary across the groups, and what were the interruption results?
Yes. So we're measuring this as part of an item of the index. So we're looking at the number of interactions. I often get this comment though, and I think it's absolutely important. But we randomly assigned our participants, and we didn't really study this aspect of the question, right? Which is a very important one, but it's not one we really addressed. It's randomly assigned. We might look at whether there are differences. We could do that. Yeah. In the final outcomes, right, whether it affected the conversation, depending on these types of characteristics as well, even though when I look at the pre-characteristics of these groups, they don't significantly differ in their composition on these types of factors that we collected, right?
I just meant in general, descriptively, across the groups, do you see one specific type of person interrupt more
Oh yes, sometimes, I mean, yes, like I can give you examples, but I don't know how systematic it is, right? This happens, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Federica Carogatti from KCL. This is just a clarification, and it might be driven by the fact that I was trying to keep up with the presentation of the whole project before you went into this particular sort of a bit. And I'm wondering, did I understand correctly that you're planning to look at historical and online experiments at the same time? Yeah. And I'm really interested in that. And if you can just speak a little bit more about what's the hunch and what you expect to see in this comparative scenario, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, thank you. I can get to be passionate about the project. So, for example, in the Denmark case that Ali presented this morning, a comment we get a lot is, well, these were 5 groups, and what can you say from the fact that this happened only once? We say, well, a lot, because this was a really important context, a really consequential case, and it should be studied, right? We shouldn't just pick it because it allows better statistics. Yeah. But putting that into a comparative perspective can really help us to draw out some of these mechanisms that the historical cases do not allow us to investigate. So does it matter how large the group is? Does it matter whether these are 7 people or 70 people? Right? Does it matter by the type of the types of decision rule they use? As we know, as Ali said this morning, from electoral law should matter quite a lot for the different outcomes you get.
Thank you. I want to think a little bit more about the comparison of the kinds of arguments that you saw people use in the strategic deliberation treatment, in the non-strategic treatment. So in the strategic deliberation treatment, you have a game, right?
Yeah.
And in that game, I don't know, as I said, I don't see the payoffs, but it's a dominant strategy, is that right, for them to be preferring the high tax?
It's a what?
Is it a dominant strategy for them to be preferring the high tax?
Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off for them, yeah, in which the people who are taxed more highly should be preferring a lower tax. Yeah.
Okay, so...
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But it's a game, and what they want to do is to incentivize their fellow players, right. To make one set of choices as opposed to another set of choices, right? And in that game, presumably, they're going to be using arguments that speak to their payoffs as you have given to them in the game, right? Yeah. Whereas in the non-strategic treatment, that set of considerations is off the table, right? Yeah. The only relevant considerations, presumably, if any, are going to be frame-related considerations, which is to say, it's climate change, right? Or do we support, higher, lower, or sort of more aggressive or less aggressive policy in response to climate change? Mm-hmm. So in some sense, it's not surprising that you will see very different kinds of arguments that would be on the table, right, in the 2 kinds of treatments. Mm-hmm. Am I
But
wrong?
Eventually, the decision remains the same. Whether you know about it before you talk to these people or afterwards, the decision that you have to take as a group is the same. The incentives are the same. The financial incentives are the same. I mean, so the difference is whether you figure this out before you talk to people and whether that changes the types of communications they have with one another, or whether you only realize this afterwards, right?
But the deliberation treatment is the treatment without the payoffs, is that right? Or did I...
Same payoffs.
Same payoffs. Okay, so there's some aspect I'm missing. So what's the difference between the strategic deliberation treatment and the deliberation treatment?
Yeah. The only difference is that you know it before you enter the Zoom room. So we tell you everything about this election that you will have about a policy option before you go into the Zoom room in the strategic treatment, whereas we only tell you this after you've been in the Zoom room in the normal, just regular deliberation treatments. In terms of financial incentives and payoffs, etc., everything stays the same.
Okay.
And we also have the control group, same incentives. The only difference is they don't talk.
So what is your explanation for the differences in the arguments that you're seeing?
Well, we need more support from the measuring the mechanism, but I'm buying into this idea that, deliberation is going on and, there's an exchange of views and people either, spend more attention on something. Maybe they're really persuaded, even though they don't tell us they're persuaded in exit surveys. Or maybe it's the information that we're presented with and that they have processed in a different way when the group is in a normal deliberation environment versus a strategic one where they know this will have consequences for the payoffs in the experiment.
Sorry. Yeah. So what you just your answer here about strategic interaction made me think about the Denmark example. So one of the things that a question I was sort of left with, and maybe we don't know enough about it. Why did they divide up into 5 groups? It didn't seem like they were specialized committees. It seemed right. They were debating the entire document in each group. And what's interesting is if you imagine. If you can control the deliberation of one group who is the decision maker, then all of a sudden the stakes are very different compared to if there are 4 other groups who are all doing the same decision, right? Your own, that changes the strategy because being decisive, steering your group to one decisive conclusion would be different than for other ones. So basically what I'm thinking of is, why don't you try to mimic the structure of the Denmark example? This might be it goes beyond this, but if you're trying to test some of these strategic mechanisms, right, it seems like the context having a very different structure might have some of these knock-on effects when you think about the other groups who are also deliberating on the same question.
That's one possibility and an important one, and that's why I also wanted to really present the framework, because it really fits into that. I think it's also important to keep the research on topic. Like, it matters because today we're trying to get good outcomes from these deliberative groups. We don't have to necessarily assume that they will be manipulated, but we can learn from these past cases and find out whether maybe sometimes they were, or what the reasons were why they were perhaps less successful than some of the other examples we had, and to really understand the context and how it influences the quality of a deliberation.